But what about specific groups within society? The youth in Germany were treated to their own special method of being dealt with. At school, students were indoctrinated from an early age. Subjects at school were tailored but to be pro-Nazi and taught by pro-Nazi teachers. For example, in history, students were taught that Germany had been stabbed in the back at the end of World War I by weak politicians, and how Jews had caused the hyperinflation and Great Depression. In biology, students were taught that the Aryan race was superior in intelligence and strength, and that the Jews and Slavs of Eastern Europe were subhuman. Even in maths, problems would be set with a political agenda. They taught how to calculate weapon trajectories, as well as deal with social issues. Here is an actual Nazi maths question.
The Jews are aliens in Germany. In 1933, there were 66,060,000 inhabitants of the German Reich, of who 499,862 were Jews. What is the percentage of aliens in Germany?
Chemistry also investigated chemical weapons and explosives. These subjects became appealing to young Germans and helped them keep them in awe of the Nazis. Even outside of school, young people were subjected to Nazism.
The Hitler Youth allowed youngsters an opportunity to play sports and learn map reading skills. The opportunities to go camping would be particularly appealing for children from poorer families who could not afford to go on holiday. The focus on the military kept the Hitler Youth interesting as it allowed children to practice gunfire and play war games. German girls joined the German Maidens League and were taught how to cook, sew, as well as take part in exercises. Children were encouraged to talk about their families, which often led to informing about any anti-Nazi sentiments or comments they may have said. The idea that children would become more loyal to Adolf Hitler than their parents. To ensure this, other potential rival groups were banned or absorbed into the Nazi youth groups.
Hopefully, you'll be aware that this attempt to control the youth of Nazi Germany was not always successful. In 1933, despite the lack of other options, only about 50% of boys were members of the Hitler Youth and only 15% of girls. As the 1930s wore on, a lot of people began to get bored of the pro-Nazi propaganda they were subjected to. By 1939, membership to the Hitler Youth was compulsory and the leaders began to get stricter as World War II began and the need for solid discipline for the next generation of soldiers showed. This put off some teenagers from joining and instead joined smaller groups that had grown in response. Perhaps the least dangerous to the Nazis were the swing kids.
They rebelled by ignoring the ban on jazz and swing music and went to secret clubs to meet up with the opposite sex and dance. They identified themselves with British and American culture and dressed like the teenagers from these countries. Perhaps slightly more threatening were the Edelweiss Pirates. Although in reality they weren't one big group, they were actually small groups of working class teenagers that hung out in different cities around Germany. The Nazis labelled them all Edelweiss Pirates though. Children could leave school at 14, but didn't have to sign up to the army until they were 17. Because of this, a lot of teenagers decided to hang out with their friends in between these ages. They went camping, sung songs that mocked Germany, insulted the Hitler Youth, and occasionally attacked them.
Because these were German children, the Nazis weren't sure how to deal with them. They would need soldiers in the future and factory workers, so they could not all be rounded up and imprisoned. Eventually, as World War II heated up, the Edelweiss pirates began to help army deserters and escaped prisoners. They stole weapons and took part on attacks on the Gestapo. In one incident in Cologne in 1944, the Gestapo chief was killed during a pirate attack. The 12 ringleaders were rounded up and publicly executed by hanging.
Nazi control of women was more successful in some respects. The Nazis had a very clear idea about the role of women during the 1920s and early 1930s. They were there to support their husbands and raise a family. Some traditional women supported this, especially in the countryside. However, in the cities, women tended to want to carve a career out for themselves. During the Weimar years, women were given more freedom. For example, by 1933 there were 100,000 female teachers, 3,000 female doctors, and 13,000 female musicians. In fact, 1/10 of the Reichstag members were female. Unfortunately, for the Nazis, this increased interest in jobs and the wider availability of contraception meant that the birth rate was decreasing.
If Germany was to become a great power once again, it needed a large population to provide factory workers, soldiers and taxpayers. The government decided to increase pro-motherhood propaganda and offered special loans to newlywed wives to encourage them not to get a job. This proved quite successful, with 800,000 women taking up on the offer. Medals were also awarded to encourage childbirth. Having 4 children would result in a bronze medal, 6 a silver and 8 a gold. This effort worked as the national birth rate went up 30% from 1933 to 1936. It was only during World War II that the government decided to reassess whether women should be kept out of the workplace. They needed more people working in the factories as the war effort began to fail.
The Nazis needed to make sure they got the workers supporting them, particularly as they had closed down the Social Democrat Party, the SDP, who the workers usually voted for. The key issue facing much of the working class in 1933 was crippling unemployment. In 1933, there were about 6 million workers unemployed in Germany due to the Great Depression. Hitler had promised jobs, and so immediately got onto the task of providing them. He created a new Nazi trade union called the German Labour Front, in which all workers had to join up to, and then set them off to work building public works projects. These included building motorways, called autobahns, railway tracks, hospitals, schools and other public buildings. Hitler also announced rearmament, and in 1935 introduced conscription into the army, which also reduced unemployment.
Wages were tightly controlled and were kept low. To ensure that all the workers did not rebel, the Nazis created the Beauty and Labour Organisation, which looked to improve working conditions by, for example, providing good ventilation in factories and organising hot meals for lunch breaks. Workers also benefited through the Strength Through Joy organisation, which offered to workers cheap cinema and theatre tickets, the opportunities to go on cheap holidays, and even schemes which allowed them to save up for their very own Volkswagen Beetle. This kept the workers in line. Although their conditions did not improve massively under the Nazis, at least there were more jobs available.
The Nazis would argue on all their campaigns that the farmers were the foundation of Germany. The Nazi philosophy on farmers was called blood and soil, meaning that the farmers were the basis of the German master race. Once Germany had expanded into Eastern Europe, it would be these peasant farmers that would be supplying the fatherland with food. As such, the Nazis knew they needed to be protected. They created the Reich Food Estate, which bought all the produce off the farmers for an agreed price, which then sold it on to the rest of Germany. This ensured that the farmers were guaranteed a decent price every year. However, some farmers didn't like the Nazis interfering with their business. For example, the government announced that every chicken should produce 65 eggs a year. This put pressure onto the farmers. Also, the eldest son inherited the farm. Many of the other children left the countryside to find decent work in the cities. This meant that the population in the rural areas dropped by 3% every year, the exact opposite of what the Nazis were trying to achieve.
Lastly, the Nazis had to deal with the businesses. All businessmen appreciated the Nazis for crushing the communists who posed a threat to them, as they would want to see all companies run by a communist government. Before 1933, small businesses had struggled as the big department stores were being created around the country, and which would sell their products much cheaper than small shops. The Nazis passed laws that banned the expansion of department stores, which helped smaller businesses out a fair bit. They also closed down rival Jewish-run shops, which meant they would have more customers to sell to. This helped as trade nearly doubled inside Germany between 1933 and 1937. Big businesses were also doing very well. The Nazi trade union never went on strike, which meant that industries were running more efficiently.
Chemical firms prospered as the government paid them to supply them with explosives and fertilisers. Volkswagen and Mercedes also benefited from machinery contracts. So let's summarise. How well did the Nazis control Germany? Well, you'd struggle to find any real public show of anger against the Nazis. Historians argue about why this was.
Some suggest that it was due to terror. Most people believed the Gestapo to be a very powerful organisation and were afraid that if they protested against the Nazis, they would be imprisoned and perhaps even executed. The existence of concentration camps became known to people and deterred dissent against the government.
But some historians argue that terror isn't enough to keep a country quiet. Some historians argue that a lot of Germans appreciated that the Nazis were actually making Germany stronger. In the 1930s, the German people might have argued that the economy was improving, traditional values were being reintroduced after the chaos that was the Weimar government, radicals such as the communists were being dealt with, and internationally, Germany was becoming stronger, developing its army, and reversing the Treaty of Versailles, which was painfully unfair.
Other historians argued that people did not want to protest as they feared they may lose their jobs. The Great Depression was a terrible time for Germany, and no one wanted to go back to living in poverty. As such, workers and businessmen alike tried to appear pro-Nazi to ensure they kept their livelihood.
Finally, historians might argue that it was all about propaganda. The Germans had been subjected to Hitler's speeches, censored newspapers, biased radio reports and pro-Nazi films that they would have genuinely believed that Hitler was good for Germany. This may have been enough to keep down opposition against the Nazi Party.